Thank you very much. As you just heard, I've been asked to say a few words, and I will keep it to a few words about, I guess, the history and the present possibilities. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, the history and the present possibilities of what we just heard, of dialogue, of the power of art to influence culture and to change the world, so to speak, about how an exchange of knowledge across cultures can foster mutual understanding. The hope is, of course, that the artists that we will see and that I understand will be going around with Edge of Arabia for 3 years in this project, such as Taysir al-Batanji, if that's the correct pronunciations, exhibits such as Photo Fest that we just heard about, that Wendy and Fred did so much to bring to life here in Houston, that Culture Runners and, of course, Edge of Arabia and Art Jamil will foster some more understanding in America of the complexity and the diversity of Middle Eastern worlds and foster what we just heard, some sense of cultural dialogue. And what I said when I spoke at the MFAH, and what I wrote in my book, one of my earlier books called Faith Misplaced, The Broken Promise of U.S.-Arab Relations from the 19th century to 2001, is that of course the idea of cultural understanding and of course its opposite, cultural clash, is bound up and tied up to a notion and an understanding of the past and not just, of course, the present. I made the point that a century ago there was, of course, a very positive image of America in the Middle East, not just in the Arab world, also in Iran and Turkey. There was no such thing, of course, a century ago of any of the organizations such as ISIS or ISIL that we hear so much about today, nor was there anything called anti-Americanism. In fact, of course, there were at the time artists, there were landscape artists, there were missionaries, there were educators, there were scholars, there were travelers. There were all sorts of people who crossed borders, and indeed American missionaries who had initially gone to the Middle East to convert everyone, to tell people what they should be, ended up understanding that they had to listen and engage in a form of dialogue. So they ended up opening the 3 major universities that still dominate the educational landscape of the Middle East: AUB, the American University of Beirut; AUC, the American University in Cairo; and of course Robert College in Istanbul, today Boğaziçi University. There was also, of course, an Arabic migration to the West. So long before Edge of Arabia, and in a sense to put this in context, there were immigrants, writers, artists who came here beginning in the late 19th century, people that you may have heard of, like Gibran Khalil Gibran, the author of The Prophet and many other writings, Amin Rihani, a brilliant travel writer who was obsessed and interested in America and in Arabia. And in other words, it was a very long and quite rich history of encounter, of people trying to foster what we call dialogue and encounters. But there's also, and this is the point I'd like to really ask, hopefully, or not ask, it's for Dina to ask, but maybe the panelists can discuss this. There's also, in addition to that wonderful history, that older history, there is, of course, a more sobering history that we are all aware of. A history of U.S. political interventionism. We could use the word U.S. imperialism in the Middle East, beginning in the Cold War, and of course continuing until our own time. So just as the Arab world of today is radically different from the Arab world, and the Middle East is radically different from the Middle East of the 19th century, so too, of course, America, that enchanted the East and Eastern immigrants in the 19th century and in the early 20th century with its skyscrapers, its technologies, its cities, its urban layout. Today, of course, the United States is radically different as well. The U.S. presides over an empire in the Middle East, and I wonder how art in this context can and will relate to this political project. The U.S., of course, supports Israel. The U.S. supports anti-democratic regimes in the Gulf in particular. Regimes that are, you said, were difficult places in a sense to do art, but also more fundamentally, difficult places to do democracy and human rights. So in such a climate, I wonder how and to what extent dialogue actually, what it means. And of course, I have faith just as these artists do and these people do, in the power of art and in the power of humanities, to educate people, to inform people, to come to a better understanding of themselves and of others. I wonder how this dialogue and this project, this really important and interesting and fascinating project, intersects with a reality that we see around us today. What then, in the end of my comments, what is the relationship between dialogue and power? And I was reminded of the ancient Greek historian Thucydides in his history of the Peloponnesian Wars, where he recounts an encounter, quite a famous encounter, between the people of Milos, the inhabitants of the island of Milos, and the Athenians. And the people of Milos were besieged by the Athenians, and they pleaded to the Athenians not to ransack their city, and they said they were neutral, and they said that they had they were not aggressors against Athens, but the Athenians nevertheless sacked the city of Milos, killed its men, and enslaved its women, despite the fact that the people of Milos had said, let us engage in understanding and in dialogue. And the Athenians said pointedly, or so Thucydides recounts, that justice only applies among equals. And therefore, I was thinking, what and how do we have dialogue when we have no equals? How? It's not to say, of course, the whole point of art and humanities is to subvert the history of power relations, but to what extent and how can and does art, humanities, music, literature, the whole ensemble of what we're talking about, actually affect and influence this imbalance or relate to this imbalance of power? My hope at the end is that we can, all of us, and especially the artists and the educators here, can in fact engage in a process that makes us, in a sense, far more cosmopolitan. Cosmopolitan in the sense of not just understanding others, but also understanding some of the strangeness in ourselves. I think when we do that, we can begin a process of mutual understanding, or at least understanding. And then we can hopefully one day move to more elevated themes of dialogue. But thank you, and good luck.